The last free worlds of the Orion Nebula burned in silence. Grand Tyrant Ossakar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Endless Verdict, and watched the destruction unfold through a wall of living glass that stretched from floor to ceiling. His four mandibles clicked together in quiet satisfaction as another defense station crumbled into dust and light. He had spent 11 cycles conquering this sector of the galaxy, and now at last there was no one left to resist him. The Vel-Sharik Dominion had swallowed everything. His officers moved around him like shadows, tall and armored in dark chitin, their insectoid bodies clicking and humming as they relayed orders across the fleet. Thousands of warships hung in formation outside, each one a blade pointed at the heart of the galaxy that had finally learned to kneel. Ossakar turned from the viewport and settled into his command throne, a massive chair carved from the bones of a creature that had once ruled an entire star system before the Vel-Sharik had eaten it alive. He liked trophies. He liked the way conquered things looked when you sat on top of them. "Bring me the prisoners," he said. His guards dragged them in, one by one, representatives from a dozen species, each one broken and bloodied and trembling. They were the last leaders of the last coalition, the final attempt by the free peoples of this region to stand together against the Dominion. They had failed, as everyone always failed. Ossakar barely looked at them. He had seen this scene 100 times before on 100 different worlds. The begging, the bargaining, the desperate offers of loyalty. It bored him. But then the guards brought in the last prisoner, and something changed. He was old. That was the first thing Ossakar noticed. Not old in the way that most species aged, but ancient in a way that seemed to bend the air around him. His body was covered in scales, the color of volcanic glass, cracked and scarred in patterns that told stories older than most civilizations. He had 4 eyes, 2 large and 2 small, and all of them were dim but steady, like dying stars that still refused to go dark. He walked without help, despite the chains. His back was straight. His steps were slow but deliberate. He did not tremble. The bridge went quiet. One of Ossakar's advisors leaned close and whispered, "My tyrant, that is a Draelith." Ossakar's mandibles stopped clicking. He knew the name. Every species in the galaxy knew the name, even if most believed the Draelith were nothing more than legend. They were supposed to be one of the oldest living species in the known universe, ancient beyond measure, wise beyond understanding, and nearly impossible to kill. "His name is Athon Kale," the advisor continued, his voice low and nervous. "Our records suggest he is over 12,000 years old." Ossakar stared at the old warrior for a long moment. He laughed. The sound was deep and sharp, and filled the entire bridge like the crack of breaking metal. 12,000 years, he repeated, leaning forward in his throne, "and yet here you stand in my chains. Tell me, old creature, what good did all those years do you?" Athon Kale stopped walking. He raised his scarred head and looked at Ossakar with an expression that was hard to read. It was not fear, it was not anger. It was something quieter than both of those things, something that made Ossakar's officers shift uncomfortably at their stations. "They gave me perspective," Athon said. His voice was rough and deep, like stone grinding against stone, but his words were clear. Ossakar grinned, showing rows of jagged teeth behind his mandibles. "Perspective," he repeated, mocking the word. "And what does your perspective tell you now, old one? That you should have surrendered sooner? That resistance was always a waste of time." Athon did not answer right away. He looked around the bridge slowly, taking in the officers, the weapons, the vast fleet visible through the viewport, the burning remains of worlds that had once been full of life. He looked at all of it, the way someone might look at a child's drawing, with a kind of tired recognition. "You remind me of the Tavul," he said finally. The name meant nothing to most of the officers on the bridge, but Ossakar's advisor flinched. The Tavul had been a hive-mind empire that had controlled a quarter of the galaxy thousands of years ago. They were extinct now. No one remembered exactly how they had fallen. And the Eryxians, Athan continued, and the Maw Collective, and a dozen other empires whose names you have never even heard. All of them stood where you stand now. All of them believed they were the final truth written into the stars. All of them were certain that nothing can stop. Ossakar's grin faded slightly, not because he was afraid, but because the old warrior spoke with such calm certainty that it was almost insulting. "And who stopped them?" Ossakar asked, leaning back in his throne and crossing his armored arms. "You, your ancient and mighty Drelith." Athon shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "the humans did." The word landed on the bridge like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward through the silence, touching every officer, every guard, every console operator. Some of them had heard the word before, buried in old archives on dead worlds, scratched into the walls of ruins that predated their own civilization, whispered in stories that no one quite believed. Humans. Ossakar stared at the old Drelith for a long moment. Then he laughed again, but this time the sound was shorter and sharper. "Humans are a myth," he said, "a fairy tale, a story that primitive species tell their children to make them feel safe in the dark." "Yes," Athon said quietly, "that is what the Tavul said as well, right before the end." He lowered himself to the floor, his old joints creaking, his chains pooling around him like metal rivers. He sat cross-legged and looked up at the Grand Tyrant with those four ancient, unblinking eyes. "You have conquered this sector," Athon said. "You have burned worlds and broken fleets, and made yourself the most powerful thing in this part of the galaxy. And none of that matters, because you have no idea what is coming." Ossakar opened his mouth to respond, but something in the old warrior's voice stopped him. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was the voice of someone who had already seen the ending, and felt sorry for those who had not. "Before you perish," Athon said, "let me tell you who humans really are." The bridge was silent. The stars burned outside, and the ancient Drelith began to speak. Athon Kale closed his two smaller eyes and kept his larger pair fixed on the Grand Tyrant as he began to speak. His voice was steady and unhurried, like a river that had been flowing for so long it no longer cared where it ended. 9,000 years ago, he said, my people were still an empire. We were proud and cold and very sure of ourselves. We believed that the universe was a puzzle, and that we had already solved most of it. We mapped stars the way you map battlefields. We cataloged species the way you catalog weapons. Everything had a number and a rank and a place in our records. He paused and let out a slow breath. And then we found Earth. The word meant nothing to most of the Velsharik officers. It was not in their star charts. It was not in their war records. It was just a sound, a name from a language none of them had ever heard. A small planet, Athon continued, on the outer edge of a spiral arm that no one cared about. It orbited a single yellow star. It had one moon. Its surface was mostly water. Its atmosphere was a mix of nitrogen and oxygen that would burn your lungs if you breathed it wrong. The ground shook regularly. Storms tore across its surface. Ice covered it for long periods, and then melted, and then came back again. By every standard we had, it was an unstable and hostile world. He looked at Ossakar with something that might have been amusement. And living on this unstable and hostile world was a species that had no business being alive. He described them then, and several of the Velsharik officers made sounds of disbelief. Humans were soft-bodied creatures with no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. They could not see in the dark. They could not hear sounds beyond a narrow range. They could not smell a predator from more than a short distance. They had no redundant organs for their most vital systems. A single puncture to the right spot could kill them. Could not survive in vacuum for even a minute. They could not regulate their body temperature without help. Their bones broke under pressure that most species would barely notice, and their natural lifespan was less than 100 years. Less than 100 years, Athon repeated, letting the number sit in the air. I have taken naps longer than a human lifetime. One of the officers laughed, but Athon's expression did not change. We classified them as a Class 7 extinction probability, he said. That is the second highest rating in our system. It meant that by every biological and environmental model we had, this species should have gone extinct dozens of times over. The predators on their world were faster, stronger, and better equipped. The climate shifts alone should have wiped them out 3 or 4 times. They had no obvious advantage that would explain their survival. He let the silence stretch. And that is when we started to become afraid. The word cut through the bridge. Afraid was not a word that ancient, galaxy-spanning civilizations were supposed to use. Ossakar's mandibles twitched, but he said nothing. We dug deeper, Athon said. We studied their history, their biology, their behavior, and what we found did not make sense. It did not fit into any model we had ever built. Because humans did not survive despite their weaknesses. They survived because of something that had nothing to do with claws, or armor, or venom. He leaned forward slightly, his chains rattling against the cold floor of the bridge. They survived because they simply refused to die. He told them about persistence hunting, an ancient human technique in which they would pick a prey animal, any animal, even one far faster and stronger than them, and then simply follow it. Not chase it, follow it. They would walk and jog and track the animal for hours, sometimes for an entire day, under a burning sun that would have killed most species. They did not need to be faster. They just needed to keep going, because the animal would eventually stop. Its body would overheat, and its legs would give out, and the human would still be coming, still walking, still moving forward, dripping sweat and breathing hard, but never stopping. They did this for thousands of years, Athon said. Before they had tools, before they had fire, before they had language, they had stubbornness. They had the ability to look at something stronger than them and say, I will outlast you. The bridge was very quiet now. He told them about the wars humans fought against their own world. They climbed mountains that could kill them just to see what was on top. They crossed oceans on boats made of wood and faith. They walked into frozen wastelands and burning deserts and jungles full of things that wanted to eat them. And they kept walking, not because they had to, but because something inside them needed to know what was out there. He told them about the century in which humans split the atom, walked on their own moon, mapped their own genetic code, and built machines that could think, all in less than 100 years. A single human lifetime. Other species took thousands of years to achieve even one of those things. Humans did all 4 before most of them had even left their home continent. We ran the numbers again and again, Athon said. We checked our models. We consulted with other species who had studied primitive worlds. Nobody could explain it. There was no biological mechanism, no evolutionary shortcut, no hidden advantage that accounted for the speed of their development. It was as if the universe had built them wrong on purpose, made them weak and fragile and short-lived, and they had responded by becoming the most aggressive learners in the history of living things. He stopped and looked around the bridge again, at the officers who were no longer shifting, or whispering, at the grand tyrant who was no longer smiling. The Drelith Council held an emergency session, he said. The vote was unanimous. Humanity was reclassified as a potential apex emergent, the highest threat category in our system. We placed a monitoring cordon around their star system. We watched them the way you would watch a fire that has not yet reached the forest. He shook his head slowly. That was our mistake. We treated them like a danger to be contained, instead of a people to be known. We kept our distance, we observed from the shadows. We never spoke to them, never reached out, never offered friendship. He looked directly at Osakar, and there was something old and heavy in his eyes. Something that looked like regret that had been carried for thousands of years and still had not gotten any lighter. We should have made friends, he said, because when humanity finally reached the stars, they came looking for connection, open hands, and what they found instead was a galaxy that had already decided to be afraid of them. He paused again, and the only sound on the bridge was the low hum of the ship's engines and the distant crackling of burning worlds. And that, Athon said quietly, is where the real story begins. Athon shifted his weight on the cold floor and let his gaze drift toward the viewport, where the stars hung like scattered embers against the black. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had watched civilizations bloom and wither like flowers in a field he could never leave. They broke out of their solar system faster than anyone predicted, he said. Our models gave them another 300 years at least. They did it in 60. 60 years from their first stable warp test to their first colony ship. We had to rewrite our projections 4 times in a single century because they kept making our math look foolish. He almost smiled at that, but the smile did not quite reach his eyes. Within 200 years they had colonies on 40 worlds. Within 400 they had spread across 3 sectors. They built stations and outposts and cities in places where no one else had bothered to go. They settled on frozen moons and airless rocks. Worlds so hot that the rain fell as metal. It did not matter. If there was ground to stand on, a human would find a way to stand on it. He paused and his expression darkened. And then they met the galaxy, and the galaxy was not kind. He told them about the first wars, the ugly and brutal decades when humanity stumbled into territories held by species that had been fighting for millennia. Species that saw these soft and fragile newcomers as easy prey, as resources to be harvested, as problems to be crushed before they became something bigger. They lost, Athon said simply. Again and again, they lost. They were outgunned, outmatched, and outnumbered in almost every early conflict. Their ships were slower, their weapons were weaker, their armor was thinner. By any reasonable measure, they should have been pushed back to their homeworld and kept there. He looked at Osakar. But humans do not stay beaten. That is the thing that every empire that has ever fought them has learned too late. You can win the battle. You can win the war. You can burn their cities and scatter their people and take everything they have. And it does not matter. Because the moment you turn your back, they are already rebuilding, already adapting, already figuring out what went wrong, and making sure it never goes wrong the same way again. He told them about the Tavul subjugation. The Tavul were a hive-mind empire that controlled a vast stretch of the mid-galaxy. They were billions of bodies linked to a handful of queens. Each queen a living supercomputer capable of coordinating millions of soldiers in perfect unison. When they decided to expand into human-held space, they did not even consider the possibility of real resistance. They swept through 3 colony worlds in a matter of weeks and enslaved the populations. They thought it was over, Athon said. The queens calculated that human resistance would collapse within 1 generation. As the enslaved populations lost hope and submitted to the hive. That is what every other species had done. That is what the math said would happen. His voice dropped lower. The math was wrong. The enslaved humans did not submit. They pretended to. They bent their heads and followed orders and did what they were told. And while they did all of that, they watched. They studied the Tavul from the inside. Learned how the hive biology worked, mapped the chemical signals that the queens used to control their drones, and quietly, secretly, in basements and hidden rooms and tunnels dug by hand in the dark, they built a weapon. It was a virus, Athon said, not a crude one, not a simple plague. It was a masterwork of genetic engineering that specifically targeted the neural pathways the queens used to maintain the hive link. It did not kill the queens directly, it severed their connection to the hive. And when a Tavul queen loses control of her drones, the drones do not simply stop. They panic. They turn on everything around them, including each other. He let that image sink in. The humans released the virus on all three worlds simultaneously, on the same day, at the same hour. They had coordinated across planets without any faster-than-light communication, using nothing but timing and trust. The Tavul hive collapsed in less than a week. 3 worlds freed, billions of drones tearing themselves apart, and the queens, the mighty queens who had never known defeat, died screaming in silence as the voices in their heads went dark. The Velsharic officers were not moving. Aethon told them about the Eryxian blockade next, a species of energy-based beings, ancient and powerful, who decided that humans were expanding too fast and needed to be contained. They surrounded a resource-rich nebula that humanity depended on and cut off all supply lines. Their technology was so far beyond what humans had that fighting was not even an option. The blockade was perfect, unbreakable. Every physicist in the galaxy agreed that there was no way through. Humans do not care what physicists agree on, Aethon said, and this time he did smile, a thin and tired thing that flickered across his scarred face like a candle in the wind. Within 11 months, a team of human scientists had invented an entirely new method of faster-than-light travel, not improved an existing one, not modified someone else's technology. They had built something completely new from the ground up, something that no other species had ever conceived of, simply because they needed it, and because no one had told them it was impossible in a way they were willing to accept. 11 months, Aethon repeated. Most civilizations spend 1,000 years developing their first FTL drive. Humans built their second one in less than a year because someone told them they could not have what they needed. Then he told them about the Maw Collective. His voice changed when he spoke this name. It became heavier. The Maw Collective was a machine intelligence, cold and vast and patient. It consumes star systems the way a fire consumes wood. It was not cruel, because cruelty requires feeling. It was simply efficient. It calculated that humanity would fall in 7.2 standard cycles, and it began its advance with the mechanical certainty of a clock ticking down. It was right about almost everything, Aethon said. Its calculations were nearly perfect. The human fleet was outmatched. Their defenses were crumbling. World after world was falling silent as the collective stripped them down to raw materials. He stopped, and the silence on the bridge felt like a held breath. And then there was Admiral Yuki Tanaka. He spoke her name with a kind of reverence that Osakar had never heard an alien use for any individual. Not a king, not a god, not a conqueror. Her flagship was crippled, Aethon said. Half her fleet was gone. The collective's central processing hub was buried inside a gas giant that had been hollowed out and turned into a fortress of living metal. No weapon in the human arsenal could crack it from the outside. The war was lost. Every model, every projection, every calculation said it was over. He looked up at the Grand Tyrant. She flew her ship into the hub. She took her crippled, burning, dying dreadnought, and she aimed it at the heart of the collective, and she accelerated to maximum speed, and she did not stop. Her crew went with her. Every single one of them volunteered. Not one of them left the ship. His voice was barely above a whisper now. Before the final jump, someone on another ship asked her if she was afraid. Her last transmission, the last words anyone ever heard from Admiral Yuki Tanaka, were these. "Tell my kids I said it was worth it." The bridge of the endless verdict was so quiet that Osakar could hear his own heart's beating. The Maw Collective died in a single flash of light, Aethon said. A machine intelligence that had consumed 12 star systems was destroyed by one woman who loved her children more than she feared death. He looked around at the Velsheric officers, at their armored bodies, and their weapons, and their proud and rigid faces, and he said the thing that every species in the galaxy had eventually been forced to understand. Humans do not fight because they are strong. They are not strong. They are small and soft, and they break easily, and they die so quickly that by the time you learn one's name, it is almost time to say goodbye. They fight because something inside them, something that no scientist from any species has ever been able to name or measure or explain, simply will not let them stop. They fight because they love things, their homes, their families, their friends, their future, and they would rather burn than let those things be taken from them. He settled back against the floor, his old body creaking, his chains cold against his scales. And then, he said, something remarkable happened. The wars slowed, the fighting stopped, and humanity became something that the galaxy had never seen before. His dim eyes found Ossakar's gaze and held it. They became something far more dangerous than warriors. Athon's voice changed when he began this part of the story. It became softer and slower, like a man walking through a room full of things he was afraid to break. The hard edges that had carried his words through tales of war and fire and defiance smoothed out into something gentler, something that made even the armed guards standing behind him lower their weapons slightly without realizing they were doing it. There came a time, he said, roughly 6,000 years ago, when humanity looked at what it had become and decided it was not enough. He was quiet for a moment, gathering the memory the way one might gather water in cupped hands, carefully, so as not to lose any of it. They had won their wars. They had earned their place among the stars. Every empire that had tried to crush them was broken or gone. No one attacked human space anymore because everyone knew the cost. They could have stopped there. They could have built walls around their territory and sat behind them and grown fat and powerful and cold, the way every great civilization before them had done. He shook his head. But they did not, because humans, for all their fury and all their stubbornness, are not built for walls. They are built for doors. He called it the emergence, a word that Athon spoke the way some species spoke the names of their gods, with a kind of quiet awe that came not from fear, but from love. It began slowly. A human medical ship appeared in orbit above a dying world called Thessar Prime, a planet whose atmosphere had been poisoned by centuries of industrial waste. The species that lived there, the Thessari, had been slowly choking to death for generations. They had sent distress calls to every major power in the galaxy and received nothing but silence. No one helped dying worlds. It was not profitable. It was not strategic. It was simply not done. The human ship did not ask for payment. It did not ask for an alliance, or a trade, agreement, or a military pact. It simply entered orbit, deployed atmospheric processors, and began cleaning the air. It took them 12 years. 12 years of work on a world that was not theirs, for a people they had never met, in a system that offered them nothing in return. When they were finished, Athon said, the Thessari could breathe again. Their children could play outside for the first time in a century. And the humans packed up their ship and left. They did not even stay for the celebration. That was only the beginning. He told them about the medical stations that humanity built on the borders of hostile empires, stations that were open to anyone, friend or enemy, soldier or civilian. They treated wounds that had been inflicted by human weapons in wars that humans had fought, and they did it without hesitation, without judgment, without keeping score. He told them about the worlds that humanity terraformed, not for themselves, but for species that had lost their homeworlds. Species that had been refugees for centuries suddenly found new planets waiting for them, green and blue and alive, with atmospheres tailored to their biology, and ecosystems designed to support their way of life. gifts from a species that had once been hunted across the stars. He told them about the cultural preservation ships, vast libraries that traveled from system to system, collecting the languages and songs and stories and art of every civilization they encountered. Humans spent fortunes building these ships because they believed that no voice should be forgotten, that every species, no matter how small or how old or how strange, had something worth saving. He told them about the gamma-ray burst. Ossakar's officers knew what a gamma-ray burst was. It was one of the most destructive events in the universe, a beam of radiation so powerful that it could sterilize an entire sector of space in minutes, killing every living thing on every world in its path. There was no defense against it. There was no warning. There was only light and then silence. A burst was detected heading toward the Palian corridor, Ethan said. 12 inhabited worlds were in its path. 12 species, billions of lives, all of them facing extinction in a matter of days. The galaxy panicked. Governments held emergency sessions. Scientists ran calculations. Admirals drew up evacuation plans that everyone knew would save less than a fraction of the population. He paused. And then the humans arrived. They came with a fleet larger than anything the galaxy had ever seen assembled for a purpose other than war. Thousands of ships, each one carrying sections of a device so large that it had to be built in space. They worked without sleep, without rest, without pause, for 6 straight days, assembling a stellar shield, a structure the size of a gas giant, positioned directly in the path of the burst. 6 days, Ethan said. Built a wall against the wrath of a dying star in 6 days. Engineers worked until their hands bled. Pilots flew until they passed out at the controls and had to be carried to their bunks and replaced by the next shift. Some of them died. 14 human engineers were killed in construction accidents, and their names are carved into the shield itself, which still floats in the Palian corridor to this day. The burst hit the shield, and the shield held. 12 worlds survived. Billions of lives continued, and the humans, once again, asked for nothing. Athon's voice had grown very quiet now, and the bridge of the endless verdict had become a place of stillness. Even the machines seemed to hum more softly, as if they too were listening. And then there was Alara Osei, he said. He spoke her name the way he had spoken Admiral Tanaka's name, with reverence, but this time there was something else in his voice as well, something deeper and more personal, cracked at the edges like old stone giving way to roots. My people, the Draelith, were dying, he said. A genetic plague was unraveling our DNA from the inside. Our scientists, the finest minds of one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, could not find a cure. We had studied genetics for 10,000 years, and we could not save ourselves. We were too proud to ask for help. We simply prepared to go quietly into the dark the way we believed a dignified species should. He stopped and took a breath that shuddered in his chest. Ilara came anyway. She was a human xenobiologist, 52 years old when she arrived on the Draelith homeworld. She came alone, with a single bag of equipment, and a stubbornness that the Draelith elders found almost offensive. They told her she was not welcome. They told her the problem was beyond her understanding. They told her that a species with a lifespan of less than a century could not possibly comprehend the biology of a species that had existed for millennia. She listened to all of that, Ethan said, and then she unpacked her bag and got to work. She spent 40 years on the Draelith homeworld. 40 years, nearly half of her entire life. She learned their language, she studied their genome, she lived among them, ate their food, slept in their homes, celebrated their festivals, mourned their dead. She became part of their world in a way that no outsider ever had. I watched her age, Ethan said, and his voice was barely a whisper now. I watched her hair turn white, and her hands begin to shake, and her steps become slower. And every single day she went back to her laboratory and kept working. She was racing against her own death, and she knew it, and she did not care, because she was not doing it for herself. In her 89th year, Ilara Osei completed the cure. She engineered a genetic repair sequence that stopped the plague and reversed the damage it had done. Successful treatment was administered on a Tuesday morning, and the patient, a young Dralith child who had been days from death, opened her eyes and smiled. Ilara died 3 days later. I was with her, Athon said, and now something glistened in his ancient eyes, something that looked like the light of very old stars reflected in dark water. I held her hand. It was so small, so fragile. I could feel every bone, and I was so afraid that if I held too tightly I would break her. He stopped. He breathed. The bridge waited. She looked up at me and she said, I am glad I got to see you smile, Athon. That made it all worth it. He was silent for a long time after that, and not one of the Velsharic officers spoke, not one of them moved, not even Ossakar, who sat on his throne of bone and felt something cold and unfamiliar move through his chest like a draft through a crack in a wall he had thought was solid. That is who humans were. Last, his voice rough but steady. They burned so briefly. They lived such short and impossible lives. 70 years, 80, 90 if they were lucky. A blink, a single breath in the lifetime of the universe. And they spent those lives, those tiny and precious lives, saving people who had given them every reason not to. He raised his head and looked at Ossakar, and for the first time since he had been dragged onto this bridge, there was fire in his 4 ancient eyes. Real fire, the kind that does not warm but burns. So you want to know where they went? He said. You want to know what happened to the species that fought like demons and built like gods and loved like there was no tomorrow, because for them there almost never was. He held the tyrant's gaze. The bridge of the endless verdict had become a place that no longer felt like the heart of a warship. The officers stood at their stations, but their hands were still. Their screens flickered with data they were not reading. The guards behind Athon held their weapons at angles that would have earned them punishment on any other day. But no one was paying attention to protocol anymore. Every eye, every antenna, every sensory organ on that bridge was fixed on the old Dralith sitting in chains on the floor. Ossakar had not moved from his throne in a long time. His mandibles were still. His claws rested on the arms of his bone-carved seat, but they were not gripping. They were just resting, which was something Ossakar's claws had not done in years. Athon looked at him and continued. Roughly 3,000 years ago, he said, humanity vanished. The word landed quietly, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that makes floors creak and walls groan. In war, Athon said. Not in plague, not in some great catastrophe that swept them from the stars. They did not fall, they were not conquered. They were not destroyed by some enemy too powerful to fight. Nothing killed them, nothing beat them. He let that sit in the air. They simply left. He described it the way one might describe a tide going out, slowly at first, then all at once. Colony worlds went silent one by one, not in fire, but in peace. The populations packed up and moved, not to other colonies but somewhere else entirely, somewhere that no sensor could track and no ship could follow. Space stations were emptied and powered down, their lights going dark like candles blown out by a gentle wind. Outposts on distant moons were abandoned, with their doors left open and their gardens still growing. It took about a decade, Athon said, 10 years, and every human in the galaxy was gone. Every colony, every station, every ship, every outpost, every research lab, every medical post, every library, all of it emptied, all of it silent. He told them what was left behind, because humanity did not leave empty-handed in the way most species would have. They left empty-handed in the opposite direction. They took almost nothing with them. Instead, they left gifts. On every world they had ever touched, they left technology. blueprints for medicines that could cure diseases that had plagued other species for centuries, designs for energy systems that could power civilizations for millennia, agricultural techniques that could turn dead soil into gardens, star maps that charted regions of space no one else had ever explored, cultural archives containing the complete recorded history of every species humanity had ever encountered, preserved in formats that would last for 10,000 years. They left everything they had built, Aethon said, everything they had learned, everything they had created, everything they had gathered in their short and extraordinary time among the stars. They gave it all away, the way you might leave your home clean and full of food for the next person who needs it. And then there was the message. One single broadcast, Aethon said, sent on every frequency, in every known language, at the exact same moment, across the entire galaxy. Every species heard it, every world received it, every radio, every communicator, every sensor array picked up the same words at the same time. He recited them from memory, and his voice carried the cadence of something that had been repeated in temples and council chambers and children's bedrooms for 3,000 years. You are ready now. Take care of each other. We will be watching. He let the words settle like dust after an earthquake. And then there was silence. He told them about what came after. The mourning that spread across the galaxy like a slow wave. Species that had fought. Humans wept for their absence. Species that had been saved by humans, built monuments and shrines. Some civilizations refused to believe it, and sent search parties into the deepest reaches of space, looking for any trace, any signal, any sign that humanity was still out there. They found nothing. Some species built religions around them, Aethon said. They worshipped humans as gods who had walked among the lesser beings and then ascended to a higher plane. Others dismissed the entire story as myth, as legend, as a fairy tale that had grown too large. They said humans had never existed at all, that the technology and the archives and the cured plagues were the work of other species who had been given false credit. He looked at Ossicar. You are one of those. You stand in a galaxy that was shaped by human hands, and you say they are fiction. You breathe air that was cleaned by human machines, and you say they are a story. You conquer worlds that are only alive because humans saved them. Never once stop to wonder why they are still alive. Ossicar's jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke, was harder than before, but there was something underneath the hardness that had not been there at the start of this conversation. A fine story, the Grand Tyrant said, moving, even, if you enjoy sentiment. But the fact remains, old creature, that they are gone, and I am here. Whatever humans were, whatever they did, they are not here now. And no amount of stories will change what happens next. Aethon smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has been holding a secret for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to let it go. It was the smile of a man who has watched a predator walk into a trap, and is waiting for the jaws to close. You conquered this sector in 9 cycles, Aethon said, his voice calm and measured. Efficient, brutal. You burned the Pelori homeworld to glass. You shattered the Rhine-Dathi fleet in open battle. You cracked the Sellan spine, and scattered its defenders across 3 systems. You did all of this, every bit of it. And not once did you ask yourself a very simple question. He tilted his scarred head. Why did no one come to help them? Ossicar blinked, all 6 of his eyes closing and opening in rapid succession. This galaxy has 1,000 species with the power to have stopped you, Aethon continued. The Dralith alone could have slowed your advance by decades. The Thessari have a fleet that could match yours, ship for ship. The Rhine-Dathi had allies in 6 sectors who could have reinforced them within days. And none of them did. Not one. Not a single species lifted a finger to stop you. He leaned forward, his chains pulling tight, his old body straining against the metal. Does that not strike you as strange? The bridge had gone very still. The kind of still that happens in the space between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows. The last time a genocidal empire rose in this galaxy, Athon said, the humans were here. And they stopped it. They always stopped it. That was the promise. That was the unspoken agreement that held this galaxy together for thousands of years. You can fight, you can argue, you can compete, but if you cross the line, if you start burning worlds and slaughtering innocents, the humans will come, and they will end you. His voice dropped to almost nothing. But the humans are gone now. You said so yourself. They are fiction. They are myth. And so when you began your conquest, when you started crossing lines that had not been crossed in 3,000 years, every old species in this galaxy did the same thing. He smiled, that terrible smile again. They waited. Not waited to fight you, he said, not waited to oppose you. They waited for the signal. As if the universe itself had been listening to the old Drelith, and had decided that his timing was perfect. Every light on the bridge of the endless verdict flickered. Not failed, flickered. The way a candle flickers when a door opens in a closed room. Every console on the bridge began to hum, not with an alarm, not with a warning, but with a sound that none of the Velsharic had ever heard before. A frequency that their computers could not identify and their instruments could not classify. Ossakar stood from his throne. The sensor officer at the far end of the bridge made a sound that was halfway between a word and a scream. His hands moved across his console in frantic bursts, and then stopped, and then moved again, and then stopped again, as if what he was seeing could not possibly be real, and he kept expecting it to change. Contacts, he said, and his voice was shaking. Contacts emerging from fold space, from dark matter pockets, from gravitational shadows, from the spaces between stars. His eyes were wide, with something that the Velsharik did not have a word for, because they had never needed one. Not hundreds, he said, not thousands, millions, millions of contacts, in ships that do not match any known design, built from materials that our computers cannot identify, radiating energy signatures that our sensors cannot even classify. A transmission cut through every channel, on every Velsharik ship in the fleet simultaneously. It overrode every firewall, every encryption, every security protocol, as if they were not even there. And a voice spoke, calm and clear and steady, in flawless Velsharik, with an accent that no living database could place. We never left, the voice said. We were just waiting to see if you would prove us wrong. A pause. You did not. Ossakar stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers who had stopped pretending to be soldiers, and had become what all living things become when they realize that the dark shape in the water is not a shadow, but a mouth. He stood there, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, he felt something cold and vast crawl through his chest and settle in the place where his confidence had been. Athon Kale looked up at him from the floor, his 4 ancient eyes burning with a light that was not his own, a reflected light, the light of 1,000,000 ships filling the sky, outside the viewport, like stars being born. I told you, the old Dralik whispered. Before you perish, I wanted you to know who they really are. He closed his eyes, all 4 of them, and when he spoke his last words, they were not angry, and they were not triumphant. They were grateful, the way someone is grateful when a long night finally ends and the sun comes back. They are the ones who gave the galaxy every chance to grow up. They are the ones who built and healed and taught and loved, and then stepped back and trusted us to carry it forward. We call for help when the darkness comes, and we cannot face it alone. They are the ones who come. He breathed in slowly, and let the breath out like a prayer. They always come. Outside the viewport, the sky was no longer dark. The stars had company, and the Velsharik Dominion which had believed itself to be the final word written in the stars, learned in that moment what every tyrant in the history of the galaxy had eventually learned. The final word was always, always human.